Hi, everyone. I'm Steve Kepp, a co-founder of From Day One, our forum on corporate values, and we're looking forward to today's webinar. But before we introduce today's speakers, I want to tell you about another webinar that we have coming up that may be of interest to you. On Thursday, October 7th, we'll be hosting Hiring for Potential in an Era of Digital Disruption. In an economy where the technical skills needed for tomorrow will be different from today's, employers can hire with more foundational qualities in mind: the ability to adapt, solve problems, and pursue continuous learning. What can companies do to recruit for these aspects and make sure they're valued and promoted within the organization as well? This webinar is free to attend, and I'm putting the link to register in the chat space right now. And now on to today's webinar. Our title is The Inclusive Job Interview: How It's Making Tech Recruiting Effective, Efficient, and Equitable. Moving past subjective tech interviews and their built-in biases, a new generation of interview engineers is opening the door to a larger, more diverse pool of future software engineers. Newly opened doors require movement in a new direction, but also a new understanding of why that direction has been chosen. Fundamentally, why is tech hiring hard to get right? Why is inclusion so important, and how does it impact tech enterprises? What can you, our participants, do to reach these new goals? Today, Karat co-founder and CEO Mo Bhende, former head of global strategy for Xbox at Microsoft, will talk about how Karat was created, how it works in unique ways, and his vision of the future of hiring when virtually every company needs more tech talent. Before we dive into the topic, we'd like to thank our partner, Karat. I'll tell you a little bit about them. Karat conducts technical interviews for hiring companies with a transformative approach that aligns talent acquisition and engineering teams, adds interview capacity, and helps employers fulfill their commitments to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now, a few quick logistical items. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand within 24 hours after the event. So look out for an email with that link. That email will also have info on how you can get professional development credits for this session from the Society of Human Resource Management. And look out for a written account of the conversation soon on our website at fromday1.co. Around 45 minutes into the webinar, we'll have a Q&A session. That comes from you, and you can submit your questions anytime using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Now I'd like to introduce our moderator, the writer, editor, and content strategist, Emily McCrary Ruiz Esparza, who has written for Fast Company, Uncubed Studios, and In Her Sight, among others. Okay, Emily, over to you.
Thank you, Steve, and welcome to everybody who's here with us today. Not only have I worked in tech for many years, I've also written a great deal about it. Tech as an industry has had a diversity and inclusion problem for quite some time, struggling to bring in marginalized and underrepresented people and keep them there. If the tech industry can address its hiring and retention problems, not only will the workforce writ large reap the benefits, so will consumers who will have access to more innovative, more representative tech products. I'm really happy to be here with Mo and to discuss what Karat is doing to contribute and to really push this change in the tech industry. So to begin with, Mo, for those who aren't familiar with Karat, could you talk about the company's origins and the world of technical interviewing?
Sure. Well, thank you, Emily, and thank you, team, for being here. It's great to be here. So in terms of founding story of Karat, I've always loved hiring and helping people get jobs. I was most recently the global head of strategy at Xbox, and my co-founder Jeff was Bill and Melinda Gates' chief of staff at the Gates Foundation. We kind of came at this from two different lenses. At Xbox, we were hiring hundreds of engineers into my organization, and I started one day just counting the sheer number of hours that my engineers were spending interviewing versus coding. And I think the other thing related to that is none of our engineers were formally trained in how to be good interviewers. And so the net result was countless amount of hours going into a process that was oftentimes inconsistent, always oftentimes unstructured. And I couldn't help get my head around how could that be, right? And at the same time, my co-founder Jeff at the Gates Foundation was looking at candidate experiences and getting jobs. And he was asking things like, why can't candidates interview on Saturdays or Sundays? Why can't candidates have a second shot at an interview? If you don't do well at an interview, Why is it, one strike, you're out? And we kind of came at this from that lens, Emily, of asking, well, why hasn't someone come along and made interviewing a job? Interviewing's been around for thousands of years. Everyone who's probably on this call has either been in an interview or interviewed somebody. And interviewing is oftentimes pretty painful, right? And so we took it upon ourselves to say, let's take this craft and actually professionalize it and make it a job. And so in a nutshell, what Karat has done is we've now built a global network of engineers who we have equipped to be professional interviewers. We call them interviewing engineers. And we conduct, now well over 150,000 tech interviews annually a year for a wide range of companies, ranging from Indeed and Wayfair to Bank of America, Coinbase, and Robinhood. And so we're working now across both the tech sector, but also with very large institutions that are in digital transformation.
I'm always shocked at the number of organizations, tech or otherwise, who give hiring managers zero interviewing coaching, sometimes not even a rubric. It's just go hire, here's a job description and nothing else. So with that in mind, could you talk a little bit about the difference between technical interviewing and non-technical interviewing?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And first of all, Emily, like all of us who've been interviewed or have interviewed, very rarely do you get your bonus based on your interviewing prowess or skills, right? Or very rarely OKR'd on your interviewing. And so it's okay. It's just not the industry norm whatsoever. And we decided to make it our job. So the difference between technical versus non-technical, I'd say it's on two dimensions, right? One is the type of job. So Karat focuses on software engineers as a technical discipline, right? So one way to think about technical, non-technical would be the type of job we're talking about. For the purposes of this conversation, technical, as I'm speaking about it, is software engineering, but of course there's many other technical trades out there, aerospace engineering, all kinds of STEM talent. But there's another way to think about technical versus non-technical, which is skills-based interviewing versus kind of behavioral. And so what Karat is really focused on is demonstration of craft, demonstration of skills, demonstration of expertise. And so the nature of the interviews are inherently technical in that they are evaluating your ability to learn the job or do the job. And I think both are important because most times interviews today are really focused on, can you do the job today? But what you should really be thinking about is, well, if I give you learning and kind of guidance in the interview, can you learn and demonstrate the ability to learn the job I want you to do? Separate that out, Emily, from non-technical, which would be things much more like looking at your historical, kind of your resume, your values alignment for the organization. I do think this is where companies can sometimes get it wrong with looking for cultural fit versus cultural add, right? And so frankly, that's kind of the two ways to think about technical, non-technical. One is by the type of role, but the other one is the type of assessment the interviewer is conducting.
I love the term cultural add. I just wrote that down. That's a really good phrase and a really good way to enter into an interview. It sounds like a technical interview, you're going to score quantitatively. A non-technical is going to be more qualitative, maybe not come out with a hard score necessarily. I suppose there's a way to quantify everything, though in a non-technical interview, that's certainly not necessarily the goal all the time. Would you say that's accurate?
I'd say so. I'd say on the non-technical, sometimes people can kind of leave that one a little looser. I actually think because of that, it's actually even more important to get more kind of in tune with the company and with the team on what are you assessing for. There's certain behavioral traits, certain values alignment, and what are the types of questions you would do in that. One book I would recommend on non-technical interviews is called Who. It's written by G.H. Smart. It's a firm that conducts interviews for a living for CEOs of private equity-backed companies. It was one of the books I read in starting Karat. And when I think about best practices on non-technical interviews, I think that that's a must-read book for anyone that wants to learn about non-technical interview.
That's Who, WHO, is that right?
Literally Who, yeah. It's written by Randy Street, great leader, and just it's a great team. And they have a very specific methodology based on the top grading interview of we implement this, by the way, at Karat. When we do non-technical interviews, we literally follow that book to a T, and we kind of have aligned our value system against that book on how to assess non-technical skills. And then
that's it. There's the secret sauce. Giving away your secrets.
there you go. And then we use our own product, obviously,
Of course.
for all the technical side of the house. So yeah.
So it sounds like then if someone sitting in this webinar is wondering, I don't really hire for tech roles. I don't hire software engineers. Are they still going to benefit from a technical interview? Who is it for? Who needs to have a technical, maybe even just element of their interview process? Is it everybody? Is it everybody but 5%?
I think if you step back from the word technical and let's broaden outside of just software engineers, all of us who are probably here on this call today have different types of skills. And so I would kind of remove the word technical and think about just skills-based interviewing and what's the right structure. So honestly, Karat does software engineering, but you could take our business model and apply it to a number of fields, right? There's a reason we came up with the name Karat, which is broader and expansive of all the fields rather than we do engineering interviews for software engineers, right? So I think that there's a couple macro principles of knowing, well, what skills are you assessing, coming up with battle-tested questions ahead of time. Even the methodology, when we come up with interview questions, we test them on wide cohorts of populations to look for bias. We even get down and kind of gritty on how to ask the questions and when are appropriate times to give hints versus not hints. We separate out the human from the scoring. So the interviewer in our interview never scores the candidate. All the interviewer does is say, here's what happened in the interview. Our tech scores the candidate. Honestly, forget Karat for a moment. If we're just talking about skills-based interviewing, those kind of three things I just mentioned could be whether you're interviewing a marketer, a financial analyst, or a sales professional. The idea of separating out the judgment of the interviewer from the score, having battle-tested questions, and actually really thinking about, in a question design, what are appropriate guidance points. It changes the narrative, Emily, from a dreaded term that I really don't like of hand-holding, which I hate. It's the common tech term, to we're all learning and we're all improving. And so frankly, if you're not going to get some assistance in an interview, it might just, what's going on with that? And so I think we can look at those things as positives. And my encouragement is that for anyone conducting a skills-based interview to at least think through those three steps I just outlined, because I think it'll yield a better outcome.
It sounds like also separating the interviewer or the person conducting that session from the actual scoring is going to mitigate that unconscious bias that person would bring to the scoring process, which is one way. We'll keep talking about DEI as we go along, because this kind of technical interviewing is so important for a strong DEI strategy within a company. But I think that's sort of number one. That's the first place I'm seeing this be really important, is just scoring it as objectively as possible and mitigating that unconscious bias. I want to talk about then what happens in a technical interview. Let's start with the goal. What are you trying to get out of it? And then I'd like to know just an example of what goes on when you have a technical interview for a software engineer.
So I think the goal is ultimately to figure out, well, there's three levels of goals, right? So typically when we interview on behalf, so the way our model works, right, is we don't recruit job candidates. Companies send us candidates that they have recruited, and we're the interviewing company, right? That's all we do. We're not a sourcing firm or recruiting firm. Whereas if you had a massive network of engineers specializing in conducting interviews on your behalf as a company. So objective one is based on what we understand of what the company is hiring for, can the candidate either do the job today, or do they have the ability to learn the skills needed to do the job, right? So that's kind of part one of what we do. Part two of how we help our clients is things like leveling, right? A lot of our clients are trying to figure out, well, is that someone who should come in at a level 2 engineering job, a level 3? That's the next thing. And the third is, especially for our larger clients, they have teams of, let's say, hundreds of teams. They're trying to figure out, well, what team would this person be the best fit for, right? And so usually it's a 1, 2, 3, right? One of, do they have the skills to actually perform in this job, or can they acquire those? That's the bare minimum, right? But after that, they can leverage a technical interview conducted by Karat to figure out, well, where in my organization and what level should I put this person in? And I think that that's a lot of times where people go awry, right? Like how many times is it that any of us have applied to a large company and you've got to go interview with 10 different teams 10 times over versus having kind of a central point of, oh, okay, because of my skills and my interest, I belong in the search team or the data science team or the whatever. So Emily, that's kind of the first step of what comes out of a technical interview. Does that help? We can kind of now go into the nuances of how a technical interview works, but does that help in terms of why a technical interview?
Yes, I think so. Clear for me.
Okay.
Let's talk about exactly what goes on during a Karat interview session.
Yeah. So the next step is really the Karat interview. And frankly, again, let's extrapolate outside of Karat. What should go into a tech interview, Karat or not? Once you've kind of honed in on, well, what the job parameters are to conduct a job analysis, right? It really then becomes great. What are the ways to get at that, right? And so I'd roughly say that there's different assessment types or modules, right? So some are, hey, let's work on a real world problem together, right? And like, if I give you multiple kind of guidance points, can you work through that problem, right? And so in tech speak, you might think of that as pair programming, but really all it is, Emily, is it's just working on a problem together. Another type of interview might be, here's a piece of work, and specifically for senior candidates, right? I want you to go and assess it, right? So we might give a senior candidate code to review in the interview as if it was reviewing the code of a junior employee. Emily, what would you pick out as errors, bugs, things that you liked, right? Can you comment on it, right? And so that's kind of a work sample type interview where it's less about you producing something on the spot, but more how would you evaluate a piece of work almost as an editor, right? So that's kind of a second type of interview. A third might be, hey, let's dig into specific things that you've built, right? So it might be, again, we're talking about engineering jobs, but I literally think that these interview types could be extrapolated to any kind of job. It might be, okay, great. Like, what's the last project you've built? Let me try to understand it in a little bit more of a nuanced detail. And the fourth type of like module would just be what I would call knowledge questions, which is, hey, we really need developers that understand Elixir or Go or some other language, right? I'm going to ask you questions about that, right? And really try to get at your knowledge. But what we typically do is based on the seniority of the role and based on what the company is hiring for, we will mix and match those 4 archetypes of interviews and say, great, in a 60-minute interview, maybe 10 minutes of it is, let's talk about a project you've built. 30 minutes is working on a problem together. 20 minutes might be, reviewing a piece of work together. And you can see how if you take a modular approach, you can mix and match them based on the role and based on like the needs of the job. And so that's what we have learned as a best practice. So rather than having a very rigid one size fits all interview, I think you really have to start with the root of the job, conducting a job analysis, and then backing into the interview is nothing but a means at approximating a person's ability to do that job.
It sounds like the person who is conducting this interview needs to be pretty senior in the field that they're interviewing a candidate for. Is that true? Who's qualified to actually conduct a technical interview? So how do you guys pick your interview engineers?
So I'd say there's a difference in the answer to that for, yes, our interview engineers are all senior engineers, but typically, so pre-Karat, right, you'd have to have someone know all the answers to everything and have thought about the cognitive load of conducting an interview is actually pretty high, right? Because if you were interviewing me, you'd literally have to be thinking about all the ways I could solve a problem, be able to give me hints at the right time, and then you'd have to go write notes from the interview. It's a lot, right? What Karat has done is we've put all of that cognitive load into our tech platform, where our tech is coaching the interviewers, creating the interview notes, automating those parts. So I think our basic thesis at Karat is let humans do what humans are best at, which is building connection in the interview, providing guidance, looking out for outlier solutions, and let tech do what tech's good at, which is thinking about what are the optimal paths for solving a problem? Like, what are all the things? And so I would say the way to think about Karat versus the typical interview is the interviewer has to have everything in their head, pre-wired, which limits the population of who can be an interviewer and typically makes that person hyper senior and very valuable in time. With Karat, we can have a much more expanded definition of which engineers can be good interview engineers because they're all assisted through our tech platform. And most of these interview engineers, Emily, are doing this at least 10 to 15 times a week. So this is not a, hey, I kind of have a little time on a Sunday, I feel like doing an interview or two. Our data very clearly shows that the more interviews a person does, the better they get at it, right? And so to become an interview engineer at Karat is a commitment and a meaningful part of what they're doing. And many of the engineers on our platform used to work at a tech company or kind of a name brand company, and they want to be their own boss. They want to be an interview engineer, right? They want to build an interviewing business on our platform. They want to live from anywhere, work from anywhere, do things 24/7. 60% of our interviews are happening on Saturdays or Sundays, which is when candidates want to interview too, because candidates don't have time in the middle of their week to be stopping their work and interviewing for a job unless if they're really active in the market.
I mean, you want to talk about the mental load, even being an interviewee.
I know.
Is a great mental load. And then having to shift to that in the middle of the day, shift right back to your regular paid work. You may not perform as well in the interview.
No.
Even if you're having to do that. Whereas if you can wake up on a Saturday, do your morning routine, get plenty of sleep, and then feel really good, right? Just feel really good for, do whatever pre-interview ritual that you need to do to get in the right mental space for that.
That's exactly right. I think interviewing in this new world is moving to, hey, when's the company available and when can I meet with the hiring manager? To, well, this is when I perform my best as a candidate. So therefore, the company should meet me at the time that best reflects me. And I think the future of work is quickly evolving, and interviewing is evolving from candidates fitting into a company model to one that is much more flexible and ultimately accommodating of just when do people perform at their best and in what environment is that?
What do you think the long-term effects of that will be? Not just for the way interviews are conducted, but for the tech industry in general? And when are we going to see those changes manifest?
I mean, I think every customer of Karat is already seeing those changes manifest because of the interview. And I do think there's a little bit of a, the tech world talks a lot now about work from anywhere, work all the time, but yet the hiring process to get into that job is still 9 to 6, Monday through Friday, when the hiring manager is available. And so I think what you're going to start to see, Emily, is a convergence of the hiring process and like how people work. And they should be similar, right? Because how you get hired and how you work ideally is reflective of each other. And so the hiring process itself should be inclusive, it should be flexible, it should be candidate responsive, right? And so I think a couple of these tenets are going to be just the way the world is moving to, especially in this world where we all can truly, again, work from anywhere and be anywhere.
We're certainly moving toward the customer grade employee experience. And so if you can, the earlier that's begun in the hiring process, the better. So showing a candidate that you're going to accommodate their schedule, that this is the way we treat our employees, even once you're in the company. If you need to start work at 10, take a break to pick up your kid and then pick up again later that afternoon, you should be able to do that from the moment you start corresponding with that organization.
Totally.
And so, yeah, people will just begin to expect that, whether it's in tech or elsewhere. That's going to be the expectation moving forward. We're already seeing that pretty much everywhere. So let's talk about how you actually go about instituting a technical interview program within your company.
Yep.
Where do you start with this? And you can talk about, how someone might work with Karat, or if maybe it's a startup and they've got just hiring managers. Maybe they don't even have a TA person. What's the architecture of a technical interviewing program?
Yeah, I'd say regardless of whether it's a startup or a large company, there's a couple basics, which is start with the human, start with who should interview, right? And it shouldn't just be whoever raises their hand and says, well, Emily, I have 5 minutes, I have an hour of my day, I'd like to be an interviewer, which is 90% of the case, right? When we ask customers like, why, it's not who's interviewing, it's why are they interviewing? Oh, because they raised their hand. Just because you raise your hand or you're a good engineer doesn't necessarily make you a good interviewing engineer. I think our data has been very clear that those are actually fundamentally different skills. And so I think if it's engineering leader or an HR executive designing their program, I would start with who should be interviewing in the first place, and understanding that it can't just be a free-for-all. I think number two would be, what's the goals, right, of the interview program? How does it reflect, how is that interview program going to reflect the brand experience and the employee experience that comes downstream? I think you're 100% right that the employee experience starts at the point of hire. And so just how that connectivity, like writing down principles of how that's going to work really matters. I think the third thing is mapping out the workflow and the process. How are the handoffs going to work between the recruiter to the engineer, back to the recruiter, and having kind of a guideline of what that's going to look like is really critical. And I think the fourth thing is feedback is really important, right? So feedback in the process, both that you're getting from candidates, like after every Karat interview, candidates score our interviewer, they score the company, they score the question, they score everything, right? And then I would encourage any company that is thinking about designing a program to really think hard about, great, where are you going to get signals to improve that interview over time? It's really critical, right? And the interview is not even our own interviews, they're constantly adapting and constantly changing for companies. As we get more data on what's predictive, what really matters, the interview can evolve, right, and change. And so I think looking at the interview as dynamic and not, well, I thought about this and we're just going to implement it for the next 3 years. Ultimately, again, the interview is an approximation for how someone will do in the job. And so ultimately connecting the dots between who's getting hired and how they perform on the job back to your interview is really important. It's really hard, but that discipline really matters, and figuring out how to keep reinventing the interview around ultimately what is success.
How involved are your clients, your company partners in that iteration and that adaptation process?
For Karat specifically, so Karat's evolved, right? Because of the sheer quantity, right now we're, I think, but for maybe a Google or an Amazon, we're probably the next largest interviewing company currently in the planet, right? Just on first round interviews, and we'll probably eclipse them at some point. So it's different now, Emily, than it used to be, right? So now it is, okay, companies leverage us because we have a point of view on how to interview. We've interviewed across the interview industry. We can show up and make recommendations on how to structure their interview processes, right? So I would say the engagement model now is much more Karat understanding what the requirements are and then showing a medley of options so that, again, the companies don't have the time to like think through everything. And so then we get started, Emily, and then the data is really what helps us point to where to take things, right? I would say because, again, most hiring managers aren't getting paid for their interviewing selection, right? What we might hear at the beginning of, hey, I really want candidates that have these skills, actually might be different than what they ultimately hire for. So our job as Karat is to actually triangulate that and figure out, well, you really said you cared a lot about this specific language, but ultimately when you hire, that doesn't seem to be a defining criteria. So can we come back and reevaluate that? That happens 9 out of 10 times in all of our engagements, right? So we let the data do the talking, but ultimately the engagement model has really simplified so that it's not exhausting massive hiring manager cycles, but instead saying, great, we have expertise, let us provide advice on what we think is appropriate. We get started, and then the data really helps inform, and the partnership helps inform what the most predictive, fair, and enjoyable interview would be for that client.
Are you also looking at retention numbers of the candidates that you're bringing into a client's organization? How far are you sort of tracking that hire that you helped to bring in?
So that's the holy grail, Emily, like in terms of where we are heading as a company. Like my dream, right, would be like that we're retaining forever. I will tell you this, the data in the applicant tracking system is a little murky for most of our most of the industry.
Yeah.
It gets even worse once you get to performance, right? But I still think it's doable for our longer standing clients that have been with us for 3-4 years. We're doing what you're describing, and what's ultimately driving retention and usage of Karat, but also making Karat more effective, is connecting the dots between ultimately job performance back to Karat score, back to Karat interview, back to job performance, right? So we are doing that, but I would say you have to have a large enough sample set to be able to do that at scale. But what you're describing is the ultimate. I think though that we all know that there's a lot of things that happen when you start in a job that are outside of your just core technical acumen. And so part of what we have to differentiate is, well, what parts of that performance review are technical skills versus other skills?
I think companies are now actually starting, even within their own organization, starting to really look at retention as it relates to retaining diverse talent. 5 years ago, the question was diversity. Are they coming in? Are you hiring people coming from marginalized or underrepresented communities? You are, great, check, done, and not looking at the long-term effect. Can you actually retain this talent? Therefore, do you have an inclusive environment? And I think you're right. Like, that's the ultimate. I don't even think a lot of companies are there yet. They're not quite thinking about long-term retention as it relates to as sort of a litmus test for having an inclusive environment.
Yeah, I mean, my thought to you would be retention, even the word is a company favorable term, right? Ultimately, if you thought about it, if you treated your employees as the customers, or in our mindset, the candidate is the customer, the mindset would flip from how do I retain you and what are the minimum viable things I have to do to retain you to how do I grow you? Ultimately, what people want is career growth, career fulfillment, right? And so I do think part of, Emily, what's happening in the industry is, I think it's good that we're here, by the way, that many companies are now thinking about growth, right? Whereas you're totally right. 5 years ago, it was, wow, our core workforce is just simply not representative, right? But so I think this is the right next evolution. I think the companies that will end up succeeding and doing really well for their business objective, which is retention, is by flipping it and thinking about the employee as the customer and saying, ultimately, what do all of the diverse candidates that we brought into the company seek and want? They want learning, they want growth, they want fulfillment, they want compensation, they want all the things that all of us on this conference call like want. But I think it's such a simple metric flip that I think if you start with the customer and work back, it'll yield a better outcome than starting with the business objective.
Let's talk more about long-term effects. A smart technical interviewing program can have effects beyond simply placing a talented person in a seat that they're suited for, that suits them. What else can it do?
Oh, I think a number of things. One, it can optimize, the unit of currency in today's economy is engineering bandwidth, right? We are now in the tech revolution, and there's simply not enough engineers to go around. And why did we create Karat? There's not enough engineers to interview future engineers, right? It's as simple as that. And so I think part of what a good tech interviewing program will do, it'll optimize your current engineering workforce so that they can both hire and ship more product. It'll increase the morale of your engineering workforce today so that they are happier and not exhausting massive cycles in interviews and having, 14 or 15 loops for an onsite, but having 4, right? And so I think a well-designed interview program, ironically, the most immediate benefit will be maximizing your current workforce so that you just get more throughput, happiness, morale, and retention. I think the second thing it'll do is, obviously on the talent acquisition side, is bring in great candidates, right? Because I think candidates talk and they will ask, well, what is that company's process like? Is it like everybody else's, or is it indicative of their brand? Is it flexible? If I do bad in one interview, am I going to get a shot? I can speak about the redo at some point and all the data we've learned from that. But, candidates you will attract the right folks that will fit your company ethos and values if the technical interviewing program is designed with that in mind. And I think the third thing it'll do is every organization right now has skill gaps. When we started Karat and I was at Microsoft, we had a skill gap in moving to the cloud, right? We were shipping games on a disk and we wanted to ship games in the cloud. And it turned out the engineers we had didn't have the skills to interview the engineers we wanted to get, right? So I think that's okay. Every organization is going through, it's just the nature of tech, but a well-designed program will help you close that skill gap and look at it as an opportunity than as a blocker.
I know Karat keeps DEI top of mind, not only in your own organization, but in how your technical interviewing can support DEI within your clients' organizations. Do you feel that there is an awareness in the tech industry of how interview practices, technical or otherwise, affect DEI?
No, I don't. I think that's like the short of it. But I think it's okay. Like we're all, as you can probably tell with my tone, I don't look for perfection or ultimate, like these are just things that good people just need to be informed, and then we do things, right? So we just published a research on this last Thursday about the interview access gap for Black engineers with our partners at Howard University. And we did a whole study on the fact that Black engineers structurally have less interview practice. So that the first time you want the job with Karat or Google or Amazon is your Amazon interview, that's going to be really hard, right? All of us who are here on this call today probably at some point have had feedback from our interviews or feedback from hiring managers on how to improve ourselves to get to where we are. And I think that there is a structural gap in the industry, which we just know from our data. And so we published this research on Thursday with our friends at Howard. And I just hope that more people will not only read it, but do something with it and also empathize ultimately with the candidate. Back to candidate as customer. If you put yourself in the candidate's shoes versus, hey, I've got a seat to fill, but how do I help you figure out if you're the best fit for my job or like our job? It'll raise, I think, the empathy quotient of, oh, wow, are you a candidate that's had 15 job practice interviews before and you're like conditioned to solve this thing? Or are you someone that's now breaking into tech and you don't have family that's come from tech or that's been, doing that? So I just think, Emily, part of it starts with that awareness and empathy that starts with good data. So I think the polite answer to your first question would be no, but I think I'm optimistic and inherently optimistic that I think, we've got good people in our industry who will figure it out so long as they lead with empathy.
What kinds of results, let's keep talking long term, can employers expect to see from a technical interview program? You've talked a little bit about that. If you have any more to add, that would be great. I think also what needs to be said is what a technical interviewing program cannot and will not do. What problems is it not going to solve that maybe you see some of your clients saying, hey, we've got this problem, so we've come to you. So anything else that it can do, and certainly what it cannot.
I think things that it can do quantitatively is optimize the number of engineering hours going into interviews. So most of our clients before Karat are spending 70 to 80 engineering hours per hire. It is a massive sunk cost, because if you think about how many screening interviews, on-site loops, and post-Karat looks more like 20 to 30, because not only are we taking the first round interview, but we're making the whole process more predictive. Related to that is how many candidates have to come on site or for the final round to make an offer, right? So we are oftentimes improving that from bringing 4 or 5 candidates for a final process down to 2. And so I think one is just a sheer efficiency gain. The second one will be an equality and equity gain, right? So typical technical interviewing programs are constrained by ultimately engineers, right? If you get 10 resumes in, but you only have the time to interview one of them, how are you going to pick which one of the 10 should deserve and get a tech interview, right? I think with Karat, because we've made interviewing elastic and in the cloud, right? And always on, we call what we do the interviewing cloud, right? We are able to help companies assess and give a shot to way many more candidates. So I think that there is a sheer processing and expansion of opportunity that a well-run tech program will do to drive better and more equitable outcomes. And I think the third thing a good tech program will do is consistency, ultimately, of who's getting hired, the quality of hire, right? And just how those engineers ultimately perform on the job, which was kind of related to the question you asked a while ago. So again, a good tech program will drive massive gains in developer efficiency, will drive gains in equality and equity and just, access to opportunity, and ultimately will drive consistency and results. What a tech program will not do is it will not, guarantee anything, right? Guarantee that someone will take your job, guarantee success. There's no guarantees in life, right? So it's not going to be a foolproof guarantee. I think what it also will not do is I do think I loved your question at the beginning of the technical interview and the non-technical. The non-technical structured behavioral aspects are just as important, right? And so a technical interview will say, yes, Mo or Emily can do the job or can learn to do the job. That's different than Mo or Emily are going to succeed in my specific environment or like have the right values alignment to what it takes to be a good person at XYZ company. And so I think that being explicit that a technical interview is not going to do that, so you have to have a broader definition of the interview, is really important.
You mentioned earlier your work with Howard University with the report that you just released.
Yeah.
And I do recommend it. It's a great report. Anyone who's watching, it's loaded with good data, really good just information about the effect that this kind of thing can have in increasing access. Could you also talk about the Brilliant Black Minds program that you have? I think this is also really important initiative that Karat is doing. If you could.
Yeah. So when everything was happening with the calls to racial justice, which were obviously hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years in the making, right? We put our thoughts together around at Karat on what can we do with our product that was more than just press or PR, but like really substantive. And so we realized, wait a minute, the interview is a gateway to opportunity. Tech is the engine of economic wealth creation in our country right now. How do we help more Black engineers get high-paying jobs in tech? It started with a very simple question, and what can we do about it, right? And then ultimately that led us to a version 1 of this report that we published on Thursday with our friends at Howard, where we realized in the data that yes, most of the Black candidates, specifically Black candidates coming through Karat, right, from our clients kind of recruiting, just had less exposure to tech interviews. And we said, well, we're going to go change that, right? So that was the original inspiration for Brilliant Black Minds. What it then manifested into is a commitment to dedicate $1 million of our revenue from 2021 towards providing practice interviews through our friends at Howard, Morehouse, and a number of other colleges, initially the HBCUs, but we're now expanding to industry talent, providing tech interviews. And so what we now do is, I believe it was around 75 to 80% of Howard students went through 4 rounds of Karat interviews in the last year, getting feedback from their interviews and saying, hey, if you want to get a job at a company like fill in the blank, here's the skills you're going to have to learn, and here's what you're going to have to demonstrate. And we saw market improvement with those students from interview 1 to interview 4. So practice does make progress, right? I know that's like the adage, literally our data shows that. And so, we're now at a point, Emily, where we have seen enough of the data and we're on a mission to scale up Brilliant Black Minds, right? I think ultimately it will be the Brilliant program because there's brilliance in everybody, right? But we have decided to be very focused and focus on the Black community. And it is written into our strategic pillars at Karat that support of the Black community and helping more Black engineers access high-paying jobs in tech is a corporate level strategy initiative for our company, because ultimately we're a purpose-driven company, and that's our focus. But there's a lot of learning, and we're early in the era. So I would say if there's anyone here on this call who wants to learn more about Brilliant Black Minds, get involved, help us think through where to take it, I'd love to hear from you, mo@karat.com. I think it's, we have a lot more work to do in that area.
Before we move on to the Q&A, I just want to let everybody know that if you're interested in looking at the study that Mo just mentioned, Steve put that in the chat. If anybody wants to click on that, it's great. The Brilliant Black Minds program, there's a whole page on Karat's website about it, karat.com, is that right? K-A-R-A-T?
Yeah.
That can be found there. We have so many good viewer questions, so I want to get to as many as possible. If you do have any more, guys, please put them in and we'll address as many as we can get to. Mo, I'm seeing several about addressing candidate aptitude, so their capacity to learn skills. This is something you mentioned that you address in a tech interview. Can you talk a little bit more about how you do that?
Yeah, you have to have very well-designed interview questions for that. So I'd say there's 2 ways to do it. Let me actually step back. There's the One is a structural process, which is, it was crazy to us at Karat that candidates just get rejected for jobs and companies never track their aptitude or how they're progressing, right? So at some of our most, I would say, forward-looking clients, they've stopped rejecting candidates. Instead, they say, hey, you're not ready. They use the term not ready, then binary yes or no. And when you lead with that, again, candidate is your customer, it changes the equation from, hey, you're not ready yet, so can we re-interview you in 6 months or a year or 2 years, which is what we do now for some of our clients. And they track longitudinal progress of those candidates. So rather than thinking about the interview as a test that is a yes or no, looking at it as a way to engage candidates and drive engagement to track their progress, because everyone's all improving all the time. That is a total mindset shift on what the interview can be. So part one of how to assess for skills growth is just to not think about the interview as a one-stop shop or one point in time, but to think about it as a way to build a relationship with a candidate. Even if they're not ready yet today, doesn't mean that they won't be in a year. And so my encouragement would be to re-interview candidates on a regular basis, especially those that were close to your bar but not ready yet. The second thing is what you do in the actual interview, right? So this is where actually the design of interview questions is really important, right? So you could ask questions, Emily, right? Like, Mo, do you know X or Y? Or do you know, the difference between A or B? Like, those are very binary outcome conversations versus let's go solve a problem together. You might not even be familiar with this, but I'm going to coach you through the interview. And this is my guidance to anyone, whoever was asking this question, is literally you should have written down what are the types of coaching that the interviewer would do in the interview, and what are the responses that you would expect a good candidate, the candidate you would want to hire, they're all good candidates, but the candidate you would want to hire, what would they say in the interview in response to those? The most important thing is to not just leave this kind of to the realms of your interviewers, but to actually write that out ahead of time and say, hey, here's a problem statement. Here's 3 or 4 things we can give candidates clues on, and here's how we'd love for them to respond. You'll learn a lot if you're a little bit more prescriptive to your interviewers up front. But I'd say the first one, by the way, that mindset shift, my God, have I seen the clients that have done that, they've totally changed the game on their entire, we've learned from these customers, right? They've just totally changed the game on what the relationship is with a candidate from point in time to longitudinal.
And considering employers are going to have to shift to a more customer grade experience of your candidate sourcing, hiring, interviewing process, the notion of you're not ready versus get out of here is just going to change candidate and hiring pool perception. Because like you mentioned, people are going to talk, and there's a difference between you can't have this job and you were so close to the bar. Let's talk later. Like, here are some skills that you need to work on. You're not quite right for this role, but that kind of thing, I imagine, would just totally change their reputation as an employer.
So Emily, you just said something really critical in there. You said, here's the skills you need, or I can't forget how you said it. Here's what you need. You basically were saying employers giving feedback to candidates. So I think only 3% of employers, at least in America, are doing this for legal reasons, right? I think that's going to also evolve because the candidate market is moving too fast and demanding too much, that to not give feedback, I think, is going to structurally impact employers over time and their brand. And so I do think more and more we'll see that. And from the Karat lens, that is part of what we are productizing through Brilliant Black Minds, right? Why do we have candidates going through 4 rounds of interviews? Because we're learning as well, people improve, and what type of feedback is good feedback. That's never really been productized in a way that's scalable. It's always been kind of ad hoc, but I think we're learning at Karat how to do that well.
Our next question, I know you have an answer for this one and you've addressed it a little bit already. Are there courses or programs that can provide applicants with practice or training for their skills-based interview?
Honestly, just send them to Karat for now, because we have a whole practice interview program. So if you have candidates that need practice interviews, we don't charge candidates. We're not a recruiting company. We're an interviewing company. We interview for our clients, but you can literally go to our website. We have a whole practice interview program. I would say separate from that though, forget Karat for a moment. We haven't talked about it, but one of the most powerful things we have seen in our data is the power of the redo. And so think about it this way: if a candidate wants practice, your engineer or your people could give them that. Just don't, if they don't perform well the first time, give them another shot. It sounds so simple, but we've literally seen in our data that 18% of candidates actually ask for, can I get another shot? And literally the improvement ratios on that second shot and the propensity to hire are so convincingly high. So every one of our clients is now doing this. We invented it a couple years ago, and we said, this is ridiculous that people are coming to interviews, not doing well, and they will forever never get the job. That's just not the way life works, right? So I think thinking about offering redos to your candidates is something that I would honestly forget Karat for a moment. I would just encourage the industry as a whole to adopt, because I think it's just a higher empathy way to lead.
I agree. The redo is important, not only because, especially if you're thinking about a really young engineer or just a young candidate who's not familiar with interviewing processes in general, especially tech interviews, which can be incredibly intimidating because they're not consistent across different companies. You may have done a technical interview at Google and then gone to do a technical interview at Square, and they were totally different. They were scored differently, they were delivered differently. There was coaching in one, but there wasn't coaching in another. And so they're coming into a third going, oh my gosh, I'm not good at technical interviewing, just like some people aren't good test takers. So just having a redo, I think, would just help you even see a candidate differently.
Totally. And the data, by the way, that we've seen is very convincing that redos do work. And if ultimately what you all care about on the line is hiring yield, that's ultimately the real metric, which is, hey, you have 100 jobs to fill. Are you hitting 100 jobs? If a percentage of the candidates that didn't do well the first time around would do well the second time around and are people you actually want to hire, huge cost to the hiring process to not offer them a redo. Mm-hmm. And so I think we've now been running this for 3 years, and we've literally modeled out the economics with our clients, and like, it just makes business sense to offer a redo and candidate sense.
Next question: can a technical interview wind up being subjective in some ways? I.e., if the interviewer were to give more hints and help to the applicant for whatever reason?
100%. That's the problem. Literally, whoever asked that, I love that question. Yes.
Anonymous.
Anonymous, which is literally why we created Karat, because I was seeing this. Yes, I would say yes. I don't know if I have like a technical interview that is not well designed with a trained interviewer, with pre-baked when should you give hints, with a scoring mechanism that's separate from the interviewer, right? All of those things could yield to subjectivity. Well, Mo did fine in this interview and we should hire him, but then, Emily, you gave me 10 hints in the interview and you were like that's all possible if it's not codified ahead of time on what the interview should look like. And if, Emily, you're not adequately trained on, well, like, here's how to think about it. And if you're also in charge of my scoring, there's just too many things there that lead to subjectivity. So I would say whoever asked that question, the answer is yes, but that's why I think good technical interview program design can mitigate that.
Mo, could you say more about productizing feedback and helping folks fill gaps or find jobs that they are a good fit for, or helping clarify career? I think this is a pretty loaded question. There's a lot in here. Helping clarify career paths. We'll start with productizing feedback.
Yeah, they're actually kind of related. We currently fit a lot in the interviewing process, but a lot of demand we get from our clients is, can you interview my current engineers, give them feedback, and help them figure out what job in my company? We're not there yet. We will be there at some point, but let's just get to productizing feedback. I think 3 things we've learned on productizing feedback. One is I keep using this term empathy. Feedback's a gift, but feedback can be hard if not given correctly, right? So I think you have to be aware of the audience you're giving feedback to. This is someone applying to a job at your company. This is someone who's trying to break into the industry, right? Or this is someone who thinks that they're so amazing, but didn't get the job and they're angry at you, right? So I think number one, feedback doesn't exist, is not a technical product that doesn't exist in a human. There's a human aspect to any good feedback. And so I think what we are learning is being conscious of who is really important in the communication of the feedback. The second thing on the feedback is making it less about the interview question. The interview question doesn't matter. Honestly, the interview question, there could be hundreds. It's all about the competency. We've moved away from scoring based on question performance at Karat to scoring on the underlying competencies that questions are supposed to be demonstrating. So I'm trying to figure out a generic, in tech speak, right? It's the difference between, hey, you had an off by one or like this specific error on an interview question. That doesn't help the candidate versus, hey, to get a job in industry at a company like ours, you really need to understand linked lists or binary search or something, or some concept better than you do today. That is helpful feedback, right? So I think making the feedback focused on the competency really matters. The third thing is testing back for learning quotient. That's why our best clients who are not rejecting candidates and saying, you're not ready now, like let's re-interview you in a year, they're figuring out ways to productize that feedback or allow it, and then like measure that again to say, hey, Emily, I just gave you feedback on your interview. You come back and re-interview. Did you improve? Right. And so I think you want to kind of start with the human and understand who you're giving feedback to, make it about the competency, and then third, measure the feedback loop.
We have time for probably one more question, and I'm seeing a couple about how your interview engineers that are working with Karat. So number one, how are you bringing them in? It seems like maybe how are you sourcing them? Do you bring them in through your own platform? And then
Yes.
secondly, what kind of training do they get? And if within the training, could you address something like unconscious bias?
Yeah, totally. So great question. We find our interview engineers are global. Many of them come find us because a job like this has not existed before. If you are an engineer looking to freelance and kind of have flexible lifestyle, typically, you need to take on specific projects or go sell the work. As a platform, we do that. And so number one, I would say the concept of interviewing for a living has not existed before. And so many engineers are attracted to that. And they love the humanity plus tech side. If you're an engineer that doesn't like other people or like humans, you're probably not going to enjoy interviewing because you're engaging humans all the time, right? So we attract a type of engineer that I would say is professional, empathetic, kind, courteous, but also, seasoned in their skills. So I think one is who we attract. Two is how we go find them, right? Because we have a very unique value proposition, we're able to go find them through all the classic means of direct search, advertising, et cetera. So how we find them is because we have something really unique, right? A lot of engineers in the world just haven't thought about the idea of, wow, I can interview as a professional versus interviewing as a side job at my company. And I think engineers love that. Two, they have to go through at least 30 hours of onboarding and training. And so for every 100 engineers that apply to be an interview engineer, I believe only 3 make it. And so it's not an easy position to land. We find that many engineers might have the technical skills, but not the behavioral, professional, kindness, empathetic factor. So for example, engineers who want to become interview engineers at Karat have to actually go through multiple rounds of candidate interviews where we have candidates who have been trained on how to respond in interviews, who could be rude to the interviewer, who might even get up off the Zoom, walk away and come back. We literally want to see what the interviewer will do. Will you be kind? Will you be professional? And so we have a pretty high bar at Karat for redefining the standards of enjoyability as part of our mission. We only bring on interview engineers that we think will create enjoyable candidate experiences. That's a pretty high bar because think of how many interviews everyone here has been through that are not enjoyable, right? So I think the standards of how we select our interview engineers and then the 30 hours plus of onboarding. But then once you're even an interview engineer, we've created a whole performance system to track your scores, right? Candidates are rating our interviewers and saying, did we like that person? Did we not? Companies are doing the same. And so to maintain your status as an interview engineer on the platform means that you only didn't just make it, that you're continuously performing and continuously kind of demonstrating your value as an interview engineer. And I think that's a lot of what, by the way, companies sometimes miss, which is you go through this whole training, become an interviewer, but then no one's measuring your, productivity or your throughput as an interviewer. That's our business. And so that's kind of what we do.
Totally.
I know we're pushing on time, Emily, but these were great questions.
They totally are. And I'm so sorry we didn't get to everybody. Mo, thank you. I really appreciate your time and I've really enjoyed this conversation. And I'll kick it right back to Steve.
Thank you, Emily, and our excellent speaker, Mo, the CEO and co-founder of Karat. The The idea of an enjoyable interview is revolutionary, and I think it's a great idea. So progress is being made. It was great to get into this kind of depth about making these interviews more inclusive, effective, and efficient as well. Thank you again to Karat and to all of you who participated today. If you'd like to join us for more virtual events, you can head to our website at fromday1.co and check out more of our upcoming webinars. I'll mention just a few. Thursday, September 30th, we were talking about turning open enrollment into an employee retention strategy. Tuesday, October 5th, we'll be discussing innovative ways to build skills in a hybrid workplace. And Thursday, October 7th, we'll be talking about hiring for potential in an era of digital disruption. Thanks, everyone. Stay well.